Hello, Chess.com. This is FM Mike Klein. Pleased to be with you again. And we're going to continue I am Keaton Kirwa's great series on high-level entertainment. This is going to be Stunning Bishop Moves Part 1. I was inspired to make this series after interviewing I am Mark Esserman just prior to his death match. I asked him what was his favorite move of all time. Now, I thought he was going to choose knight d5 because he's a big fan of the Smith-Morra Gambit. He sacrifices a knight on d5 pretty much every game. In fact, I believe it happened in this game also. No surprise, this position came off of a Sicilian. And in this position, you can see that he's got all of his pawns back. He's trying to keep black's king in the middle of the board. That will keep the black king open to fire. And the question is, how do we do that? Now, Mark Esterman's played a lot of beautiful moves in his life, so when you ask the guy what was his favorite move of all time, you better listen to his answer. Here's what he showed us. In this position, he found it over the board, got to keep the black king in the middle, and he decided upon the beautiful bishop to h7. Now, as you're going to see in this video and the next video in this series, none of the bishop moves that I've chosen are checks or captures. Those would be too obvious. We've seen lots of bishop sacrifices in our day. Most of our bishop moves we're going to look at are going to be what you might call quiet moves. Bishop h7. Castling is now illegal. Obviously, you can't put your king in check. And here's the problem. If black does nothing, or let's just say black goes pawn grabbing, I don't know, a move like rook takes a2, way too greedy, I realize. The other thing that moving the bishop did was it opened up the file for the rook, which allows the knight access to d7. Well, clearly the king can't walk here. We have all kinds of good discovered checks with our knight. So the king has to walk to the square f8, and now comes a really great sacrifice to finish off the game. Let's see if you can find it. If you found knight takes f7, 3 cheers for you. Obviously, the knight can't be left there. It's just going to move again and devastate black's position. But once black captures the knight, we have the clever deflection rook to d8 check. And when the queen takes, we have mate on f7. Okay, so we clearly know that black cannot go pawn grabbing on a2 or some sort of move like that. In the game, black decided to capture the bishop, a reasonable choice. Now black is probably hoping to walk his king over. Turns out this rook ends up getting in black's way in just a minute. So Esserman continued with knight to d6 check. King has to walk over. Knight takes f7 anyway, awesome move. Again, if knight takes the same tactic, rook to d8, still wins the game. So black decided he had to move the knight somewhere. So knight only has one other square to move to. He chose knight c6. And now this is basically the crux of black's defense, this knight. Without this knight, the rook would be able to invade on the last row. So after knight to c6, knight e5 discovered check. The king tries to walk to safety. I think you can see this rook is taking away the king's left. Knight takes c6, and now sadly, black can't even take the knight back. If black were to do this, there's two different ways for white to deliver checkmate. Just kind of depends on your personal preference. Some of you might prefer to play queen f7 check, and after queen takes queen, rook to d8 check, queen back, and if you take with either rook, it's checkmate. Doesn't matter to me. You see this rook on h7 gets in the way. However, you might find more beauty in a different way to win. After pawn takes knight, you could decide instead to play rook d8 check. I think this one's actually more pretty. Queen takes, queen f7 check, king over, and how often do you get to mate with your last piece like this? Rook takes f8, and it's a very funny position. If this were any other piece besides a rook or a pawn, black would be able to block, but unfortunately not going to work in this game. Okay, so let's go all the way back. Black is not able to capture the knight. He chose queen to c7. It is check, so white can't quite break through yet. King has to take time out to hide himself. And now black is in dire straits here. We've got rook to d8 coming, probably queen e8 is even faster, all kinds of back rank problems. Black chooses g6, but the game finishes with queen takes, rook blocks, queen e8 check, king h7, rook f8, here comes mate on h8. Rook takes desperation. Black does manage to get the queens off the board, but white finishes off the game by simply doubling up his rooks, and with black about to be down a rook, he decided to throw in the towel. Okay, now, this move bishop h7, you might think it's a one-off, but maybe, just maybe, Esserman knew about an older game, and somehow in the inner recesses of his brain, he was able to recall this other game I'm about to show you. Hopefully you notice some similarities between the last game and this game. White's actually down a little bit of material in this one. However, the same concept applies. We want to keep that black king stuck in the middle of the chessboard. Well, if we're going to draw a parallel between Esserman's game and this game, you've probably figured out by now the correct move is the equally stunning bishop to h7. Discovered attack on this bishop, keeping the king in the middle of the board, and perhaps most importantly, preventing the defense bishop takes bishop, because now after queen takes, the king cannot run and hide on the square g8. In fact, the game is pretty much just over after bishop h7. This is just a tactical refutation of black's play. There's no way to guard this bishop on e7, so on the very next turn, white is going to devastate black by taking the bishop. Let's see, what else could black try? I guess black could try a move like bishop to d6. Let's see if you can figure out a refutation to the move bishop to d6. Well, I think it's time for us to sacrifice our queen, right? Queen to e8 check, deflecting the queen away from the bishop. And now when we take, black again cannot hide on g8, continuing problem. The queen has to block, and now it's happy fun time. You can probably take with either piece. I suspect rook takes is a better move because we're just going to play rook takes on the next turn. Of course, if black does nothing to give his king air, rook backward would be mate. There's just too many problems in black's position. So this looks like a winning position for white. And the funny thing is, if the rook takes the bishop, we can go taking this pawn, discovered check. Obviously not the best move, but if the king were to go to g8, you can see an exact replica of the Esserman checkmate here. And now for something completely different, our next position is a complicated King's Indian defense. If you're going to have a series like this, you've got to show a Shirov game. Now, Shirov ends up on the losing end of this bishop move. You guys might know the famous Topalov-Shirov game where he sacrifices bishop on h3 in the endgame. That one's so famous we're not even going to show it. Instead, we're going to show Shirov none. And in the game, Shirov took on f4 with his knight and eventually lost. There was some analysis done on this position by Grandmaster Graham Burgess, and he was wondering what about pawn takes f4. Now black would respond with bishop takes h4, pawn takes pawn, discovered attack on the queen. Both sides are playing caveman chess here, just ignoring the other's threats. Queen h6. Let's have this pawn keep on rolling down the board. Pawn takes knight on d6. And now Burgess suggests pawn to g3, and here comes a very funny line. Let's have the pawn keep taking stuff. This pawn's playing checkers all over black's position. Pawn takes e7, about to become a queen, but now black has a forced mate. Not at all obvious, but you probably figured out the first move, queen to e3 check. I don't think pawn takes pawn would have been as strong. The king would have been able to hide on h1. So queen e3 check. Now the king can't hide on h1 because pawn g2 is mate. The king's got to come forward. Now we've got two amazing bishop moves in this game. The first one, bishop h3, lures the king out. I know I promised you none of my amazing bishop moves would be checks or captures. This is not the most amazing bishop move of the analysis. The king has to capture, of course. Pawn to g2 check. There aren't a lot of ways to block. Let's say that white blocks with the rook, and now here comes the amazing bishop move. I'll let you figure out the forced mate for black. Yep. The title of this video is Stunning Bishop Moves, and there's nothing more stunning than bishop to e1. Look at this move. The bishop is in take three different ways, the knight, the queen, and the rook, but you can't take the bishop and the queen in the same move. That's a problem. Now, if you take the bishop with pretty much anything, let's say you take with the knight, then it's just mate in one, queen h6. That's not going to work. If you decide to take with, let's say the queen, I'm first going to deflect your queen by promoting to a knight. That's important. I have to make your queen take. That way she cannot block on this diagonal. Then I'll mate you queen to h6. And lastly, if you try to capture my queen instead, black plays the incredible pawn g1 knight, and it's mate on the spot. Bishop to e1. I don't know if none would have found this over the board, but you know what? Considering he's one of the preeminent problem solvers and composers of our time, I bet he would have found this. Our next position comes from the mid-1990s. We've got another British Grandmaster playing white here, Michael Adams against Robert Hubner. The normal move in this Sicilian Alapin is to unpin your knight with bishop to e2. But Adams made a particular move famous. I don't think he invented it, but this is the most famous game where it was played. He decided knight on b to d2 would be his way around the conventional lines. And after black played knight c6, one of the ideas of playing knight bd2 is to get your bishop to c4 very quickly. Okay, now after bishop c4, black has a decision to make. Does he move the queen, or does he take the knight on f3 first? Well, in the game, black played bishop takes knight on f3, and this is where things get really interesting. Well, you can't take with the knight. I mean, your knight's responsible for your bishop right here. In the game, Adams played g takes f3 and actually won spectacularly. Even though his pawns were a little bit compromised, his active pieces ended up winning the game. Since then, black has found some good ways of dealing with pawn takes bishop. But I want to show you some of Michael Adams' analysis here. One of the moves that he considered was queen to b3. I believe this move is actually still playable. Now, there's a couple things you have to worry about with queen b3. One is that black can play knight a5, and there's a way for black to get full equality. Another interesting line for black, which I don't think I'll recommend, but white at least has to be prepared for it, is this amazing move bishop takes g2. This is not the amazing bishop move I wanted to show you, but the analysis runs like this. When black loses his queen, he takes back. White takes on b7, but now black guards the rook with tempo with knight takes d4, and we have an unbelievably crazy game where white has an extra queen, but all of white's rooks are in danger. The rook on h1 and knight c2 is coming, and don't forget, white has to take time out to save his queen. I still think white's better in this variation, however, it requires a lot of complicated analysis. Let's go back. In his notes to this game, Michael Adams also gives a third idea. He was seriously considering during the game placing his queen on a4. Now notice what this does. Knight a5, well, doesn't do anything. In fact, it's illegal, so we don't have to worry about that line anymore. Bishop takes g2 can't be played anymore, because when you take the queen and bishop takes, there's no fork. White would just be able to save his rook. So the idea of queen a5 is to get rid of black's two defenses that we just looked at. Adams thought after queen a4 that black's best line was queen g5, and he was prepared to play knight takes f3, queen takes g2, king e2. And in this position, white has all kinds of compensation for that pawn. He's got rook g1 coming, he's got pawn d5 coming, the black king is stuck in the middle of the chessboard, and this would have been a really interesting way of continuing. But unfortunately, the computer strikes back. After the game, the computer found the amazing bishop move. Let's see if you can find it. Bishop to d1, a move that a human could hardly be expected to find. Now, no matter which piece we end up taking this bishop with, it gave the queen access to g2, and this is not a good way to sacrifice the pawn. If our queen takes, I don't think white has barely any compensation for the pawn in this position. And if the king takes, I think the same thing. Queen takes, and there's not nearly the kind of dynamic opportunities for white in this position. For our final stunning bishop move today, we're going to take a look at an endgame. This is Simigan against former world champion contender David Bronstein, and white has a problem. This pawn looks pretty unstoppable. What to do about the pawn? Black's about to get two queens. Now, I think most of us in this position would look for some sort of perpetual check against black's king. Maybe it exists, maybe it doesn't, but there's better than perpetual check here. White does not have to accept the draw. See if you can figure out the winning bishop move for white. No, it's not bishop h6. I know that might look tempting. The correct move is bishop to g5. Unbelievable. Stopping the queen from ever being able to come back and help the black king. Also, if the queen were to take the bishop, the queen is no longer guarding the pawn, and white has the simple method of winning the pawn. We give check on d8, probably c8 works also. No matter where the king moves on the 7th rank, the queen skips to c7, white wins the pawn, and with 3 connected passers on the queen side, white's going to be able to win the queen endgame eventually. So if we go back, we know that black can't take the bishop with the queen. If black were to take with the pawn, well, that releases the power of the f-pawn. Now white would be able to travel forward, and even though black gets a second queen, there's really nothing else he could do. Then queen to g7 is mate. I don't really see any other better move here for black. There are no checks. So in the actual game, black decided, you know what, let's go ahead and make that second queen right away and take our chances and hope we don't get mated. Unfortunately, there is a forced win, and it goes like this. Queen to e8 check, king g7. You can't really ever go to h7 because queen g6 check, and when the king travels backward, bishop takes f6, and that's all she wrote. So king g7 was forced, only move. Queen to g6 check anyway. We know the king can't go to h8, we just talked about that. So the king traveled to f8. We pick off that pawn. The king can't travel to e8 because there's mate on e7. So once again, the king only has one move. He had to go back to g8. It might look like white's going in circles after queen d8, but it's actually really important that he remove the pawn. You'll see why in a second. The king travels back to g7, queen to e7 check, king to g8, and now after queen check, black resigned. Okay, here's the difference. We know the king can't go to h7. Queen g6 check leads to mate just like before. But now when the king goes to g7, notice this pawn's missing, and that's important because now our pawn can lurch forward. And this is just mate. The king only has one move, queen check, king back, and mate on g7. So it's a little bit geometric there. The point is, though, after bishop g5, because the black queen cannot get back on the g-file to defend, it leads to either a winning queen and pawn endgame or a forced mate for white. I hope you enjoyed these stunning bishop moves. Be sure to check back soon for part 2 of Stunning Bishop Moves with FM Mike Klein.